The true power of the FLD lies in the way in which price interacts with that FLD. Here we have our three FLDs plotted on the chart, and you can immediately identify several points at which price has interacted with those FLDs. Here, for instance, you can see that price crossed down below the signal cycle FLD, that is a crossing point. Here is a point at which price came up and found resistance at the level of our signal cycle FLD. And here, over these few bars, price crossed up above the signal cycle FLD again. Here you will notice that price is in the process of interacting with our sequence cycle FLD. And so displaying the FLDs as lines on the chart is useful, but what is more useful is displaying the interactions between price and those lines. So let's display those interactions on our chart. In our properties for our sentient FLD indicator, you can see we have a section for FLD interactions. Let's turn on the plotting for the support and resistance levels of the signal cycle FLD. And let's also here enable plotting the next interactions, because the great benefit of the FLD being the future line of demarcation is that we are able to anticipate future interactions, because the line is of course plotted into the future. And here you can see the interaction in the future, or the expected interaction in the future for the signal cycle FLD. Now there are two symbols that are displayed into the future. Here you can see an example of one of those symbols. It is an upward pointing arrow. The other symbol is very simply a downward pointing arrow. The meaning of the symbol is determined by its relationship to price. And so in this example, we have an upward pointing arrow, and price, as you can see, is above that arrow, or above the FLD. When price is above an upward pointing arrow, that means that we expect support at the level of the arrow, or the level of the FLD. And so an upward pointing arrow with price above it represents a support level. On the other hand, if price were below the FLD, or the upward pointing arrow, then that arrow would represent what we call a point of acceleration, because we would expect price to cross the FLD at that point and accelerate in the same direction and, of course, generate a target. Now, in the case of a downward pointing arrow, if price is above that downward pointing arrow, then the downward pointing arrow represents a point of downward acceleration. In other words, if price were to come down to the level at which the arrow is plotted, we would expect it to cross below the FLD and continue in the same direction downwards, generating, of course, a target to the downside in the process. If, on the other hand, price was below the downward pointing arrow, then that arrow would be expected to provide resistance to price, because price would rise up to the arrow where it would encounter downward pressure from the FLD or resistance. Now, the other thing that we are plotting on this chart are the labels of the sequence of interactions between price and the FLD. Here you can see we have a label which is for an interaction pair, the BC category interaction pair. You know, of course, that we label interactions from A through to H, and so we can encounter labels that identify each one of those interactions from A all the way through to H. Because of the fact that the B and C category interactions often occur as a pair, you will often see them labeled as such, a BC category interaction pair. Similarly, the G and H category interactions are also often identified as a pair, and so you will often see a G-H category interaction pair labeled on your charts. Now let's display our next interactions for our mid and sequence cycles on this chart. Here are the properties: plot support and resistance for the mid cycle and support and resistance for the sequence cycle. And here we can see the interaction that is expected to occur with the sequence cycle FLD. You can see an upward pointing arrow. In other words, we are expecting this to be an acceleration point. It is labeled as an E category interaction. You will know from our sequence of interactions what that means in terms of the cycle analysis. We will be discussing plotting the cycle analysis on our chart in a later video, but for now what is important is that we can anticipate expect a particular type of interaction with each FLD. It is important to bear in mind that the wavelengths of these cycles differ, and so the signal cycle is the most accurate in terms of bar-by-bar interactions with the FLD. The mid-cycle FLD, because it has a longer wavelength, will often have messier or more prolonged interactions, and the sequence cycle FLD has the least accurate or the most messy or most prolonged interactions between price and the FLD. And so, although we are expecting an E category acceleration point here, because that is the sequence cycle FLD, we're not going to immediately jump into a trade on the basis of price interacting with that FLD because of its much longer wavelength. If we wanted to trade this interaction with the 6-hour cycle FLD, this is of course the 6-hour cycle, the sequence cycle on our 5-minute chart, then we would change time frames and we would be trading the signal cycle of a 6-hour cycle on the 15-minute chart. Now, the next thing that we can do is that we can plot these interactions that have occurred in the past. And so in our properties, we scroll down again to the FLD interactions, we select to plot past interactions, and let's also label those past interactions. And here you can see the past interactions labeled on your chart. Here is a crossing point symbol for the A category interaction when price crossed up above the signal cycle FLD. Here you will notice a crossing point for the mid-cycle, and that is a D category interaction. You will notice repeated D and E category interactions with the mid-cycle FLD. Which brings me back to the point that the signal cycle FLD interactions are the ones that we focus on. The interactions with the mid-cycle and the sequence cycle tend to be more prolonged and often quite messy, with some whipsawing above and below the level of the FLD. Now, I would like to point out this interesting interaction over here. It is labeled, as I think you can see, with a plus symbol and then an E category interaction label. We label interactions sometimes with a negative symbol or a minus sign and a positive symbol or a plus sign. Those symbols are applied when, following an E category interaction, price comes down and taps the FLD again. We have an E category cross, as you can see over there, and here you will notice the symbols in the past, the upward pointing arrow. When you see an upward pointing arrow in the past, that indicates that price found support at the level of the FLD. A cross symbol in the past is, of course, when price crosses the FLD. And a downward pointing arrow, as you see over here, indicates times in the past where price found resistance at the level of that FLD. And so to come back to this example over here, price crossed above the FLD in an E category interaction. It then came down and found support just a few bars after that E category interaction. That is described as a post-E category tap. Price will often tap an FLD after crossing it. In other words, median price will succeed in crossing the FLD, and then just a few bars later, price will come back and just tap it. That tap is labeled with a plus sign if it occurs after the interaction, or sometimes it will occur before the interaction, in which case it is provided with a minus sign before the category label. And so as you look at your charts, you will find examples of minus E category and minus A category interactions, where price has tapped the FLD just a few bars before succeeding in crossing it. You will also find examples of post-cross taps, such as this one over here, where after price crossing an FLD, it comes back and taps it. As a matter of interest, this A category interaction over here has been marked with a cross symbol here, because that is where the actual price cross occurred. Notice how for the 2 bars following that price cross, price came back down and tapped the FLD. Those taps are not labeled as separate interactions because these 3 bars together are considered as a single interaction between price and the FLD. Plotting all of the past interactions on your chart can be interesting, particularly as you are learning to work with the FLD indicator, but it tends to contribute towards very messy charts, and so by default these past interactions are turned off. But you can see that you can plot the symbols only or the labels only for those past interactions if you like. Hiding the past interactions and plotting only the next or expected interactions is the default way of working with the FLD indicator, and it keeps our charts clean for focusing on what we are expecting to happen next, which, as you can see, in the longer term we are expecting price to cross this sequence cycle FLD and an E category interaction. We need to give it some room to breathe because of the much longer wavelength. Price is now reaching down back to the signal cycle FLD for a BC category interaction, where price is expected to find support at the level of that signal cycle FLD. In the next video, we're going to move on to displaying the targets that are generated as a result of price crossing the FLD.